Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Annabel Crabb. Tonight, another special edition of The Drum as we probe into the fascinating world of political polling, research and messaging. Our panel tonight, Mark Textor, pollster and founder of political consultancy Crosby Textor, social researcher and director of the Ipsos Mackay Report Rebecca Huntley, and Neil Lawrence from Lawrence Creative Strategy, who worked on the Kevin 07 and Anna Bligh campaigns. Welcome to all three of you. First up, though, it's impossible to ignore the harrowing events off Christmas Island, where dozens of Iranian and Iraqi asylum seekers are confirmed dead after their boat crashed into rocks. The Prime Minister has abandoned her holiday. Here's what she had to say this afternoon.
I want to take this opportunity to thank the opposition for their very responsible approach and responsible public commentary as this matter has unfolded and while search and rescue operations are still underway, as they are today. Inevitably, there will be public debate about policies relating to asylum seekers and refugees. As I've said before, I'm all in favour of frank, open and honest national conversations about policies in this area and generally. These conversations will be had as they should be had, but these conversations are best had when they are fully informed by the facts. Whatever the debate to come about policy is, the facts are the facts.
Now, the Prime Minister's asked for a bipartisan approach here. She's set up a bipartisan committee to receive briefings. But, Rebecca, you've done really quite extensive research in this area. I'm wondering what you can tell us about what an incident like this can do to influence public opinion in this particularly central policy area.
Well, there's not much time between contemplating tragedy and analysing, is there, Annabel? I don't really know how people might react to something like this. I don't necessarily think it will inevitably spark an informed debate about asylum seekers. From what we see from our research, I think there'll be, if I'm going to make an educated guess, there'll be a mixed response. There'll be some people, I wouldn't want to put a number on it, who would think this sends a message to people who want to come to Australia that it's a dangerous way to come to Australia. And there'll be some people who think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. There'll be some shock and outrage and horror at this tragedy from people, but I don't necessarily think that it will change their vote. These are people who are quite angry about the position both political parties have taken on asylum seekers, so I don't think this will necessarily change them. And then there's this kind of, middle ground of people who, I've got to say, I don't know whether this will make them go out and say, I want to know more about the people coming here and seeking asylum. I want to know more about the processes that they go through. I have absolutely no idea whether this is going to change the debate or not. I think there's a lot of posturing at the moment because lives have been lost, and this actually shows that these are people coming here. But I don't necessarily think we're going to get an informed debate in the next couple of weeks on the asylum seekers.
Yeah, well, my apologies. I don't mean to spring on you an instant diagnosis of what this is going to mean. I guess my question is about this is a fairly complex issue in Australian politics, isn't it? And certainly one that's figured politically this year. It seems to be such a mixture, this issue, of all sorts of different emotions, I suppose, and factors. So this incredible visual sight, of a manifestation of this issue that we seem to have been kind of dancing around all year. It seems like it must do something to change the dialogue that we're having. Mark, have you any opinions on that?
Well, I think the phase we're in at the moment is an extraordinary one. I think what the political parties will be doing is threefold. Firstly, number one priority would be to make sure the issue is handled with the sensitivity it deserves. It's an extraordinary event. It's an extraordinary tragic event. Number two, I think they'd be very, very keen to make sure nothing they do or say distracts from the recovery effort. And three, they will obviously, now that there's an ongoing investigation, be seeking as much information as possible. I don't think anybody who is a political operative would be thinking about the politics of this right now, frankly.
And that's certainly been the message from the Prime Minister. In this year's election campaign, of course, the issue of asylum seekers and border protection was a pervasive one. In July, the then Immigration Minister, Chris Evans, told a private audience at a Sydney conference that the policy area was, quote, killing the government. And of course, when the Labor MP for the Western Sydney seat of Lindsay, David Bradbury, turned up for a photo opportunity with Julia Gillard, here they are manning the decks of a patrol boat in Darwin Harbour, it became obvious that Labor was hearing the message from its heartland loud and clear. And the coalition used strong imagery in its campaign advertising to evoke the arrival of boat people in Australian waters. This ad used what commentators referred to as a Dad's Army arrows system to point out where illegal immigrants were arriving. And Tony Abbott repeatedly promised to stop the boats. Neil Lawrence, how does this complex area get winnowed into such sort of simple campaign messages?
Well, one of the key things in election campaigning is to simplify the message, but hopefully not make it as simplistic as I believe that advertising was from the coalition. And, it really did give a very graphic but oversimplified view. I think the Labor Party completely failed, though, to address that. They were very scared by it, they were getting their own polling in, they were running from it, and they failed to prosecute what I think is a very effective case against that simplification. Facts such as less than 2% of Australia's immigration actually comes from so-called illegal arrivals and many other things. The Labor Party froze, they got scared, they failed to prosecute against that.
And why do you think the Labor Party, what are they scared of? I mean, they think they're going to lose an election on asylum seekers itself? But this is the thing, I thought they almost lost the last election. This is what I think about their position on asylum seekers. It doesn't pay off, does it?
The fact that you saw David Bradbury, who lives in the west of Sydney, on a boat 2,000 miles north, looking out for illegal boats, I think tells the tale. It was very strange, very odd imagery. But yeah, they do it because they're scared of losing. And they may start from a position of saying, if you don't do something about this, you will lose. But that's where they failed. They didn't really attempt to have a clear answer.
This issue, I think, always works, and similar issues always work on three levels, as you know. The first is, obviously people have positions on issues. You've gone through those. But secondly, your response or non-response to those issues creates a differentiation on higher order issues, whether you have a clear position or not. And I think the problem for the Labor Party throughout the campaign is their position was confused, whereas Tony Abbott's position, whether you agreed or disagreed, was very clear. And this spoke to a wider set of issues about the coalition having a very clear agenda about what they'd like to do or not do in the future, whereas Labor's agenda, because of the leadership changes and other political uncertainties that were manifest in the Labor Party, that was the point of difference all throughout the campaign.
It's clear. It goes down to authenticity. It's absolutely clear in the groups that we do that even though the Labor Party have this kind of wishy-washy bet both ways about asylum seekers, people don't believe it. They believe, you're right, whether or not they agree with Tony Abbott's position that he believes the boats can be stopped and that he's got a kind of hard line on it. So it just doesn't fly. And within a broader problem about not being able to articulate a range of things. So in the last election, again, all our groups, the only differentiating factor for people was broadband, and that was only because Tony Abbott's position on broadband was strong, not because the Labor Party spent a whole lot of time arguing for broadband during the election. And you just can't get that excited about broadband.
I think they did. Actually, I think it was one of the few things they did well in the last campaign was when Julia Gillard took broadband, the NBN, to the delivery of a specific service, which was good health services in remote areas. It was the first time there was actually some sort of future narrative from either party in the campaign. I thought at the time it actually perhaps made the difference.
Well, look, before we get too far into the post-mortem of the campaign, let's talk a bit about the techniques that you're talking about. Rebecca, you were talking about groups, and there's been all sorts of criticisms, I think, after the 2010 election campaign that both sides of parties have been too poll-driven. But I want to talk now about exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about conducting polls and research. Now, Mark Textor, there are two major kinds, aren't there? Qualitative and quantitative. Can you please just give us a simple explanation about exactly what that difference is?
If possible, yes, I'll try. So we've heard two main phrases in relation to qualitative and quantitative. The first phrase we hear a lot about qualitative work is focus groups, and with quantitative works we hear about polls, News poll, Nielsen polls. And it's very simple. Imagine you had a person in your neighbourhood you had to describe to a stranger. There'd be two ways to do that in these two scenarios. The first is to give a statistical rendition of this person who might be representative of the rest of the community. You know, he's male, he's middle-aged, he's got 3 children, he drives a car, he works in a white-collar job, and he votes this way for the Liberal Party or the Labor Party. And imagine that en masse in Newspoll. Then you have qualitative or focus groups, in which case you're trying to get behind those statistics because they don't actually say anything at all about that person's aspirations, their desires, their hopes, their fears, what they expect from their political leaders, whether they think more about issues or whether they think more about the need for leadership. And qualitative is really about understanding that person enough beyond the statistics to prove his or her future behaviour. So we're delving deep here and we're asking why, not what.
So the quantitative might be just when someone rings you up, usually when you're halfway through cooking your dinner, and says, well, how do you feel about this political leader and where are your preferences lying and so on. Qualitative is more likely to be the one where you get invited in by somebody like you to a room with a one-way mirror and there's trays of biscuits around and they're being asked much deeper questions about topics that might seem to the participants to be irrelevant.
That's right. A typical focus group is 2 hours in length. You start very broad. You might talk about their aspirations in life, their aspirations of the community, their needs and desires and hopes and issues beyond the conceit of politics.
So you're
then you might get into politics.
So you're trying to get the respondent to actually lead you to their opinions rather than you just blasting their opinions out of them as you might.
Because you don't want to agenda set for them. You don't want to ask only your questions. You want to hear enough from them to understand what they're on about so you can test and check and assess the appropriateness of your agenda and your messages and your policies and your advertising.
And is that because, Rebecca, straight out asking people just, you know, what do you think about X can be a bit misleading? I mean, can people be less than frank if they think they're being challenged about an issue quite directly?
Oh, well, there's lots of problems with qualitative research, especially when you bring a whole lot of strangers into a room and they know that they're being asked questions that may be political. I don't tend to do those kinds of groups, and I've never done those groups for a political party. So that's why, even though you might get a lot of really interesting and rich data from a group, it's really about how you analyse that. It's not just taking out a few quotes about, well, when we asked them this question, people said this. It's about saying, well, at the end of that 2 hours, where did they get and what was the dynamic? So it's a complex process. But